Your Honor, this man is 87 years old. His memory can't possibly be accurate about events from 50 years ago. The words echoed through the courtroom, dripping with doubt and disbelief. The veteran sat silently at the witness stand, hands folded neatly in his lap, his face calm but resolute. Around him, 3 corporate lawyers exchanged smug glances, convinced that age had stolen his mind. But what no one knew was that this man had spent half a century carrying the weight of one horrific night. Every detail, every name, every coordinate burned deep into his soul. His memory was not just recall, it was a lifelong burden he bore alone. In exactly 18 minutes, when the questioning reached its peak, he would prove that some things are too important to forget, and that true memory refuses to fade, no matter the years. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and your support means everything to us. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had seen its share of high-stakes litigation, but the case of Morrison versus Blackwater Industries felt different from the moment the docket was filed. This wasn't about money, though millions were at stake. This wasn't about corporate negligence, though the evidence was overwhelming. This was about truth, about justice, about whether the word of an 87-year-old veteran could stand against the legal machinery of one of the world's largest defense contractors. The courtroom itself was imposing. Dark wood paneling rose to cathedral height ceilings. Rows of polished benches faced a judge's bench that seemed to tower over everyone below. The American flag stood in the corner, its red, white, and blue colors a stark contrast to the muted browns and grays that dominated the space. This was where careers were made and fortunes decided, where truth was supposed to prevail over power. But on this gray November morning, power seemed to be winning. At the plaintiff's table sat Margaret Morrison, a woman in her 50s whose father had died 3 years earlier from complications related to chemical exposure during his military service. Her case was simple. Blackwater Industries had knowingly supplied faulty protective equipment to military units in Vietnam, equipment that had failed catastrophically during a classified operation in 1971. Her father, Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, had been one of the survivors. For 50 years, he had carried the physical and emotional scars of that night. For 50 years, he had tried to get someone to listen. Now he was gone, and the burden of proof rested on his daughter's shoulders and the testimony of the only other survivor from that mission. Harold Eugene Kowalski, 87 years old, sitting ramrod straight in the witness chair despite the arthritis that had bent his spine and gnarled his fingers. The defense team was formidable. 3 attorneys from Cranston, Hayes and Associates, the kind of white-shoe law firm that specialized in making problems disappear for clients with deep pockets. They had arrived with briefcases full of depositions, expert testimonies, and character witnesses. They had psychologists ready to testify about the unreliability of elderly memory. They had military historians prepared to dispute the timeline of events. They had everything except what Harold Kowalski possessed, the absolute certainty that comes from living through hell and surviving to tell about it. The lead defense attorney was David Cranston III, grandson of the firm's founder, a man who had never worn a uniform but had made a career out of defending those who profited from the sacrifices of others. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that came from winning more cases than he lost. He approached the witness stand like a predator circling wounded prey. Harold Kowalski sat perfectly still as Cranston organized his notes. The old man wore his only suit, a navy blue affair that had seen better decades, but was pressed and clean. His white hair was combed neatly, his hands steady despite his age. His eyes, though clouded with cataracts, held a clarity that seemed to unnerve the lawyers who had spent the morning dismissing him as a confused old man whose memory couldn't be trusted. The questioning began gently. Cranston established the basics: Harold's age, his current address, his medical conditions, the arthritis that limited his mobility, the hearing loss that required him to ask for questions to be repeated, the medications he took daily for various ailments that come with advanced age. Each admission was noted carefully, building a foundation for what everyone in the courtroom knew was coming. Then Cranston moved in for the kill. "Mr. Kowalski, You understand that you're testifying under oath about events that allegedly occurred more than 50 years ago. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And you're asking this court to believe that your memory of those events is accurate and reliable? Yes, sir. Cranston paused, letting the implications hang in the air. Mr. Kowalski, can you tell me what you had for breakfast this morning? Harold blinked slowly. Excuse me. This morning. Breakfast. What did you eat? The old man was quiet for a moment. I believe it was oatmeal. Or maybe cereal. I'm not certain. Not certain about something that happened just a few hours ago. Cranston's voice carried a note of theatrical surprise. And yet you expect us to believe you can recall specific details from 1971. The plaintiff's attorney started to object, but Harold raised a trembling hand. I can answer that. Can you, Mr. Kowalski? Because I have to tell you, your medical records indicate that you've been treated for memory issues. Minor cognitive decline associated with your age. Isn't that correct? Some things I forget, Harold admitted quietly. Some things. Yes. Cranston turned to face the jury, his voice rising slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man whose testimony the plaintiff wants you to accept as gospel truth. A man who can't remember his breakfast but claims to have perfect recall of events from half a century ago. In the gallery, Margaret Morrison fought back tears. This was exactly what she had feared. Her father had warned her about this before he died. They'll try to make me look like a crazy old man, he had said. They'll say I'm too old to remember, too old to matter. But Harold Kowalski wasn't finished. Cranston continued his assault, questioning Harold's medication regimen, his living situation, his daily routines. Each question was designed to paint a picture of an elderly man whose grip on reality was tenuous at best. The other defense attorneys took notes, occasionally passing papers to their colleagues, building their case methodically. Mr. Kowalski, Cranston said, consulting his notes, you claim that on the night of October 15, 1971, your unit was conducting a classified operation in what was then South Vietnam. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And you claim that protective equipment supplied by my client's company failed during this operation? It didn't just fail. It killed good men. Allegedly killed good men, Cranston corrected. But let's focus on your memory of these events. You were, what, 24 years old at the time? 24, yes, sir. And you expect this court to believe that you can recall specific details from that night with perfect accuracy? Serial numbers? Equipment specifications? The names of every man in your unit. Harold looked directly at the lawyer. I remember everything. Cranston smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Everything. Despite your documented memory problems. Despite your age. Despite the fact that we're talking about events from 50 years ago during what must have been an extremely traumatic experience. Objection. The plaintiff's attorney finally interjected. Argumentative. Sustained. The judge ruled, but the damage was done. The jury had heard what Cranston wanted them to hear. Let me approach this differently, Mr. Kowalski. Can you tell me the name of your commanding officer during this alleged operation? Captain James Robert Henley, from Topeka, Kansas. And I suppose you remember other names as well? All of them. Cranston's smile widened. All of them. How convenient. And I suppose you remember equipment serial numbers too? Every one. Of course you do. Cranston turned to the jury again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we call false memory syndrome. The human mind, especially an aging mind, has a tendency to fill in gaps with information that seems plausible but is actually fabricated. Mr. Kowalski may believe he remembers these details, but belief and reality are two very different things. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Harold sat perfectly still, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Margaret Morrison watched her father's friend being systematically destroyed by a legal system that seemed more interested in protecting corporate profits than honoring the sacrifices of men who had given everything for their country. Your Honor, Cranston continued, I move that this witness's testimony be stricken from the record. His age, his documented memory issues, and the sheer impossibility of maintaining perfect recall over 5 decades make his testimony inherently unreliable. The judge looked at Harold, then at the plaintiff's attorney. Counselor, do you have any response? The plaintiff's attorney stood slowly. He was a good man, a competent lawyer, but he was outmatched and outgunned. Your Honor, Mr. Kowalski is our only surviving witness to these events. If his testimony is excluded, my client has no case. That's not the court's problem, Cranston interjected. The law requires reliable evidence. This man's testimony fails that standard. The judge was about to rule when Harold Kowalski spoke for the first time without being asked a direct question. Your Honor, may I respond to the gentleman's concerns about my memory? The courtroom fell silent. Even Cranston seemed surprised by the quiet authority in the old man's voice. The judge hesitated. Mr. Kowalski, you're here to answer questions, not make speeches. I understand that, Your Honor. But if my memory is on trial, I'd like the chance to defend it. Margaret Morrison held her breath. This wasn't part of their strategy. Harold was supposed to answer questions, not take control of the courtroom. But something in his voice, something in the way he sat straighter in his chair, made her think that maybe, just maybe, her father's old friend had one more fight left in him. The judge looked at the defense attorneys, then back at Harold. Very well, Mr. Kowalski. You may respond. Harold Kowalski stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting every movement. But once he was on his feet, something remarkable happened. The tremor in his hands disappeared. His voice, which had been barely audible moments earlier, filled the courtroom with quiet authority. And his eyes, clouded with cataracts, seemed to focus with laser intensity on the defense table. Gentlemen, he began, his voice steady and clear. You want to know about my memory. You want to know if I can recall the details of October 15th, 1971. Let me tell you what I remember. He turned to face the jury, his back straight despite the arthritis that had been bending it for years. Operation Nightshade. Grid coordinates 143.726 by 67.432. Insertion time 2,347 hours. Extract scheduled for 0430. 47 men went in. 23 came out. The courtroom was dead silent. Cranston started to object, but Harold's voice rolled over him like thunder. Alpha Squad, Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Sergeant First Class Miguel Rodriguez, San Antonio, Texas. Specialist Tommy Chun, San Francisco, California. Private First Class William Johnson, Detroit, Michigan. He paused, his eyes moving across the faces of the jury. Bravo Squad, Sergeant Marcus Washington, Atlanta, Georgia. Corporal David Kim, Los Angeles, California. Specialist Robert O'Brien, Boston, Massachusetts. Private James Peterson, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Cranston was frantically shuffling through papers, trying to find some document that would contradict what Harold was saying. But Harold wasn't reading from notes. He wasn't consulting records. He was simply remembering. Charlie Squad, Sergeant Paul Kowalski, my younger brother, Chicago, Illinois. Corporal Frank Martinez, Phoenix, Arizona. Specialist Anthony Romano, Newark, New Jersey. Private Stephen Anderson, Seattle, Washington. His voice never wavered. Each name was delivered with perfect clarity, each hometown pronounced with the careful precision of a man who had spent 50 years honoring his fallen comrades. Equipment manifest, 47M, 16 rifles, serial numbers beginning with 267,431 through 267478. 47 sets of standard issue protective gear, manufactured by Blackwater Industries under contract BW 71-447. 47 gas masks, model designation GM 7, supposedly tested and certified for chemical exposure. Margaret Morrison stared in amazement. Her father had told her stories about Harold's memory, but she had never imagined anything like this. Mission briefing indicated possible chemical weapons in the target area. We were assured our protective equipment was adequate. Mask serial numbers, GM 7-89341 through GM 7-89388. Radio frequencies, primary 47.25, secondary 63.15, emergency 91.80. The defense attorneys had stopped shuffling papers. They sat frozen, watching an 87-year-old man destroy their entire strategy with nothing but his memory. At 0142 hours, we made contact with enemy forces. Chemical attack commenced at 0147. Gas masks failed within 90 seconds. Not some of them. All of them. Rubber seals manufactured by Blackwater Industries dissolved on contact with the chemical agent. Harold's voice began to carry an edge, a pain that had been buried for 5 decades but never forgotten. Private Johnson went down first. Mask seal failed completely. He was 19 years old. From Detroit. Wanted to be a teacher when he got home. He died calling for his mother. Objection. Cranston finally found his voice. This is highly prejudicial and not responsive to. Overruled, the judge said quietly. Continue, Mr. Kowalski. Corporal Martinez lasted longer. Maybe 3 minutes. His mask held together better than most, but the filter failed. Filter serial number F7-22156. Manufactured by Blackwater Industries. Tested to withstand exposure to standard chemical agents. But there was nothing standard about what we faced that night. Harold turned to look directly at David Cranston. My brother Paul lasted almost 5 minutes. Long enough to help drag some of the wounded to safety. Long enough to watch his mask disintegrate around his face. Long enough to tell me to take care of his wife and kids. He died at 0152 hours. Grid coordinates 143.729 by 67.435. His mask serial number was GM 7-89367. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, too caught up in Harold's testimony to maintain her mechanical rhythm. Staff Sergeant Morrison lasted the longest. His mask held together better than the others, but the filter failed after 7 minutes. He lived long enough to see 24 good men die because Blackwater Industries cut corners on equipment that was supposed to keep us alive. Harold paused, his eyes moving across the faces of the jury. You want more details? Radio call signs. Alpha Leader, Bravo 6, Charlie 9. Weather conditions. Temperature 78 degrees, humidity 89%, wind from the southeast at 12 knots. Moon phase. New moon, 3% illumination. Extraction helicopter, UH-1D, tail number 67 to 17,432, pilot Captain Roger Thompson from Amarillo, Texas. He turned back to Cranston. Medical supplies used, 47 atropine injectors, 23 morphine syrettes, 18 bandage packs, 12 4-bags. Casualties, 24 Kia, 15 WIA, 8 walking wounded. Time of final extraction, 0647 hours, 2 hours and 17 minutes past scheduled extraction. Harold sat down slowly, his hands once again folding neatly in his lap. Gentlemen, you asked about my memory. I may not remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I remember every detail of the night your client's defective equipment killed my friends. I remember because when your friends die in your arms, you don't forget the details. You carry them with you every day for the rest of your life. The silence in the courtroom was profound. David Cranston sat staring at his notes, his carefully prepared strategy in ruins. The other defense attorneys looked like they had been hit by a truck. The jury sat transfixed, several of them wiping away tears. Margaret Morrison was crying openly now, finally understanding the full weight of what her father and his surviving comrades had carried for 50 years. Harold Kowalski sat quietly in the witness chair, his shoulders slightly bent again, the arthritis reasserting itself now that his moment had passed. But his eyes, still clouded with cataracts, held a peace that hadn't been there before. The judge cleared her throat softly. Mr. Cranston, do you have any further questions for this witness? David Cranston looked at his notes, looked at his colleagues, looked at the jury, and then looked at Harold Kowalski. For the first time in his career, the words wouldn't come. No, Your Honor. No further questions. Redirect, counselor? The judge asked the plaintiff's attorney. No, Your Honor. I think Mr. Kowalski has said everything that needs to be said. The judge nodded. Mr. Kowalski, you may step down. Harold stood slowly, using the witness stand railing to steady himself. As he walked past the defense table, David Cranston stood. Mr. Kowalski, he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. I apologize. Harold stopped and looked at the younger man. Son, you were just doing your job. But next time you want to question someone's memory, you might want to understand what they're remembering. The verdict came 3 hours later. The jury found Blackwater Industries liable for the deaths of 24 servicemen and awarded damages of $47 million, $1 million for each man who had gone on that mission, whether they came home or not. But for Harold Kowalski, the money was never the point. As he stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters and cameras, someone asked him how it felt to finally get justice. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city where he had lived for 60 years since coming home from a war that had never really ended for him. Justice would be having those boys back, he said finally. Justice would be masks that worked and filters that didn't fail and a government that didn't let corporations put profits ahead of soldiers' lives. This isn't justice. This is just making sure people remember. A reporter asked if he planned to attend the appeal hearings that were certain to follow. Harold shook his head. I've said what I came to say. I've honored my promise to their families. The rest is up to the lawyers and the judges and the history books. He walked away slowly, his arthritic joints protesting with each step, but his back straight and his head held high. Margaret Morrison caught up with him at the corner. Harold, she said, how did you do that? How did you remember all those details? He stopped and looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, but had never looked away. Your father asked me the same thing once. I told him, then what I'll tell you now. Some things are too important to forget. The names of good men who died doing their duty. The numbers on equipment that failed them. The exact time and place where everything went wrong. He paused, looking back at the courthouse. I may not remember what I had for breakfast, but I remember Paul's last words. I remember the sound Tommy Chun made when his mask failed. I remember the weight of William Johnson in my arms as he died. Those aren't memories, Margaret. Those are promises. Promises to never let the world forget what happened to them. He started walking again, each step carrying him further from the courthouse and the cameras and the victory that felt more like a memorial service than a celebration. Besides, he added over his shoulder, someone has to remember the details. Someone has to carry their names. And if not me, then who? 6 months later, Harold Kowalski died peacefully in his sleep. He was 88 years old. At his funeral, 43 veterans from 3 different wars served as honor guard. But more importantly, 23 families whose fathers and grandfathers had served with Harold in Vietnam finally learned the complete story of what had happened to their loved ones on October 15, 1971. Because Harold had kept his promise. He had remembered every detail. The lawsuit settlement funded a memorial wall at the local VA hospital. On it are inscribed the names of all 47 men who went on Operation Nightshade, along with their hometowns and the dates of their service. At the bottom, in smaller letters, is a simple inscription. In memory of those who died when their equipment failed them, and in honor of those who lived to tell their story. Some things are too important to forget. Harold Eugene Kowalski's name is on that wall too, not as a casualty of war, but as a guardian of memory. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words. Not with force, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let the truth be buried under legal paperwork and corporate liability. Sometimes an old man with arthritis and cataracts can defeat an army of lawyers with nothing but his memory and his promise to never forget the friends who died in his arms. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who carried the weight of others' stories and made sure they were never forgotten? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.